like to ask you if you've had any interactions or dealings with a man called Brian Clough over your career as a journalist. Is he someone that you came in contact with?
Oh yeah, of course. Cloughy was a great, big, wonderful figure in the game, and by the same token, spent a lot of time with Brian in his heyday and high years. I actually, to sort of start at the end, I did the last interview with Brian before he died in a hotel in Derby. It was, that was unfortunate. But what a kind of luminous presence he was flying across the game. A very entertaining, very fascinating guy. Very different from everybody else. There's one famous story. A few of us were sitting in his office with him, and he wanted to get a few drinks sent up, and I think it's not a secret that Brian had a drink problem. This was sort of after one big pre-match press conference up in Nottingham. And so he picked up the phone and rang down at the dressing room, and he said, "Hey, it's the manager here. Break us out from the chairman's room one of those precious bottles of brandy that he likes to keep for himself, and bring it immediately to the manager's office." Fine. So we sit there and nothing happens. So after about 20 minutes, and we got down at the dregs of the last bottle, he picks up the phone again and he says, "Hey, I asked you to bring a bottle of the chairman's brandy to the office. Who am I speaking to?" And apparently, and Brian told us afterwards, the voice at the other end said, "Don't you know?" It was a young apprentice apparently. You don't know who I am?" He said, "Well, I know who you are," and he hung the phone up. There was also, there were many things. I was probably the only journalist who, when Liverpool played Nottingham Forest in a big European Cup tie, then it was called the European Cup. It's since been called the Champions League, which is apparently a tournament which is mostly for people who aren't champions, because Manchester City, Manchester United, Liverpool and Tottenham are not all champions of the country at the moment. And it was a much more exclusive and much more difficult competition to win as a result. And so Liverpool are playing Forest, and I spent most of the day with Brian and Peter Taylor. "Hey, this is how we'll beat the Reds, the other Reds," and went on and on. So I said, "Okay." But it was a fascinating insight into what they were going to. "Hey, and you can't print this before the match." So I said, "Okay." So off I went, and I tipped Forest to beat Liverpool, which was not the consensus at the time. So we come to the game in Forest and they do it. So Clough is in great thing. "Hey, come to the office," and not just me, a few of us go to the office, and he says, "This man got it right," and they were pretty happy. You should never be judged on that, because predictions are just predictions, but it was a nice moment. The game was on a Wednesday night. So we went through, precious few, we went through. The hotel where we stayed was in the grounds of just across the forecourt from the stadium. I went back to collect my stuff and drive home, sadly to say, I have to admit this, drive back home to London at 11 o'clock on Friday morning. And we went through from Wednesday night to Friday morning celebrating this great triumph. Times were different then, James. But so, yes, I knew Cloughy very well, and I did do, bless him, the last interview with him.
Why do you think him and Don Revie hated each other so much? And being around Don Revie at the time he was England manager, I'm sure Brian Clough would have thought he should have had that job by all rights. What was it like, and why do you think they despised each other so much?
Jealousy, envy, clash of personalities. Cloughy was an impact manager. He'd come into the dressing room half an hour before the game, having not done training for 2 days, wearing his green sweatsuit top, brandishing his squash racket straight from the courts, and get into them. And Don was the complete man of detail. I mean, Don was the modern manager, and there was a charring of attitudes and approaches to the game then. Don thought Cloughy was too cavalier and not doing the job properly. Cloughy thought he was insanely obsessed with detail. There were then Well, there were accusations against both of them at some points in their time about whether they were acting with full propriety. Well, you know, Clough then decided to go to Leeds and try to not upstage it. He went to Leeds to try and wreck what Don had created.
Maybe try to better what Don had done.
He went to wreck it, which was why he was only there, whatever, 80 days, whatever it was. And that, of course, was, you know, not well received by Don, who'd moved on to England, nor by the great squad of Leeds players, the Bremners and the Jarses, and they resented it. So that whole thing fractured and broke down. You know, they were both great managers. And Clough found it hard to accept Revie. And then Revie got very upset by what Clough was doing to Leeds. So that's the essence of the breakdown. But I mean, if I was closer to Don than I was to Brian, which you may or may not be aware, but I mean, I perhaps the biggest exclusive story in football reporting history in this country was when Revie quit England to go to manage in Dubai. And, you know, for that I'll be forever grateful to Don. It led the front page of the paper for 2 or 3 days. It filled most of the paper for most of the week.
I bet you was the main man that week, weren't you?
It was very interesting how it happened. And I had to sit on it for some time. Don called me, was I going to the Open? We used to sometimes go to the Open Championship together, me to work and him to enjoy, a great golfer. And I said, yeah. He said, will you come through Leeds and pick me up? And I went, well, I wasn't going to fly, but, you know, that was in Scotland, of course. That would be an interesting drive. And when I got to the house, he said, you know, I'm not sure I'm going to the Open, but I want to tell you something. And just in that sense of when you're doing something extremely secret, they closed the curtains. Him and Elsie closed the curtains at the front room of the fairly modest house as it was at that time. And he told me, I'm pretty much certain I'm going to resign from England and go to Dubai, but you can't say anything until we know that everything's in place. And I've gone, my goodness. But he said, you know, my problem is getting to Dubai without, he said, I'm happy for you to have the story, but my problem is getting for you to Dubai without being, you know, my travel plans being identified and what have you. I said, well, we'll do the flights, Don. We'll book hotels, and I'll book a route which will be untraceable. So
where did you send him? What route did you send him via?
With him on it, of course.
You actually went with him yourself?
Yeah. So we flew but it took about a week or so to get this organised, and for him to get the people in Dubai for the United Arab Emirates national football team to get the financial documents into place. So we flew to Switzerland, where he checked that the finance had been done, and then I released the stuff I'd already written to the office, which was in sealed envelopes in a locked drawer in my office, which they had to break open. There was the great story of him resigning. There was also an envelope which had to be put under the door of the FA, which was his resignation letter. Late in the evening, we were doing the first publication. And so we were sitting in a restaurant overlooking a lake in Switzerland as everything was released and my first story ran at home. We then flew on. We'd actually gone from Zurich to Geneva, and then we flew back to Zurich and flew to Athens. So we didn't fly directly to the Middle East, so no one could find us, and flew from Athens to Dubai. And one guy recognized Don in the airport and called his favorite newspaper's news desk and said, oh, I know where Don Revie is going. He's going to Dubai. And they said, thank you very much for telling us. You know, please give us your name and address so we can look after you. He'd called the Daily Mail, which was a great stroke of luck. So we had where he was going then as the exclusive the second day.
Very different time. Could you imagine an England manager now like Gareth Southgate leaving England to go and manage Dubai and all that, a journalist on the way sort of helping him? It's a very, very different time.
Yes, yes it is. But let me tell you something. It's possible to have great contacts and be true to them. and it could still happen in more recent times. This is being outside the remit of football, but I broke exclusively the story of Clive Woodford resigning from England and going into football. That wasn't quite as big an impact, but it was front page, hell of a story, and in the modern era. It can be done.
How has your interactions been with modern footballers? How have you dealt with the newer players that have come on the scene? Obviously, you're an old school journalist. You're of old school values. How have you adapted, if you like, to the change in access to footballers, the change in the way footballers are reported on, the way they are seen? How have you responded to that?
I understand it all, of course, but work through the the sort of Robson generation, if you like, Brian Robson. Let's remember that many of the footballers that I've been friendly with and still am friendly with many became important managers. So those important managers would say to their players, there's no problem with dealing with Jeff. So, that helped bridge the gap to a large extent. And of the subsequent, I have no problem with Frank Lampard, for example, but then Frank Lampard is the son of Frank Lampard Sr., who is a great friend of Bobby and myself. So it's possible to find ways to work with the younger players, and whenever I do have occasion to be with them, I find them, quite respectful and quite interested in the ones who are interested in the history of football. Quite interested in the past, and I think it's possible to have a rapport with people as long as you don't patronise them and they take you at face value. You've had personal experience of seeing me with the young boxers. It's not a problem. We've got Errol Spence fighting Mikey Garcia this weekend, and this will appear subsequent to that. But on one of my recent trips to Las Vegas, I stood with these two guys in the Hard Rock Hotel in Hollywood, of all places, for an old geezer like me. And they were showing me their videos and talking and chatting, and were very happy to do so. The classic phrase is age is only a number. The question is, are you still young in your mind? Are you not prejudiced against the young, and are you prepared to give them a chance as much as you do anybody else? And I've never found it a problem.
I've had many a great night with yourself. Our nights in Vegas are legendary. I enjoyed Boston with your company very much. I thought Boston was a great trip, and I've seen you sort of interact and adapt and get your work done at the same time.
Well, there is to some extent the necessity to reinvent yourself, and I always was interested in boxing. My father was a fighter in the Second World War, a boxer as well, and so that my interest in boxing was almost as strong as my interest in football from youth. But of course, football was the vehicle you had to come through if you wanted to make it in journalism. You can't end up chief sports writer of a paper, in my view, unless you've been chief football correspondent. It is the most important thing that sport you're going to cover because of the interest of the public. Now, you can add things on. I've done a few Olympics, and I've done all the big golf tournaments and several Super Bowls and so on. But in my view, for the English market, that has to be everything is initially in the context of football. But boxing very much was part of my growing up with my father. Got bashed around a few times myself, the way you go with that is to say, now what is the sport where I'm going to have the greatest access, which you and I have been referring to, the best access to the athlete, and boxing still retains that.
Without a question.
And so I can go, as long as I don't appear too much of an old fogey, I can go and talk with these guys, and it's fine. But that requires a reinvention of how you quite approach that. I was a young guy out on the run with them. I was out drinking with George Best. To reflect on one evening with George, which I wouldn't be able to do now because of the disparity of age. But it was the Friday night before the Manchester United derby at Main Road, as it used to be called before it became part of the Ottoman Empire. And I was out with George having supper, which didn't require much food, and we ended up in his favourite casino in Manchester. And Malcolm Allison, who was manager of Manchester City, comes in. Oh, guys, this, that, and the other. And I was at the point where George had a win, so I'd taken his winnings off him and put it in the pocket so he didn't just blow it again. And he was at the point of asking me to give him some of the money back. So we then get in this discussion. Don't give it to him, says Malcolm. And I said, well, some you can have, George. And we're drinking. And so this went on until 3:30, 4 in the morning. Malcolm then, he said, I'll drop you both, you at your hotel and George on his way home at George's house. So he dropped me about 4, he dropped George about 4:30. I did well to get to the kick-off in time to report the game. Malcolm said he did well to get to the dressing room half an hour before the kick-off to talk to the team. So his team talk was, don't worry, lads. George is always our problem. I've taken care of their greatest player. I was out with him and that bastard Jeff Powell until 4:30 this morning. I dropped him off at home, drunk as a skunk. We're going to be fine today. Good luck, lads. Forget George. Go and beat them. Half-time, Manchester City 1, Manchester United 3, George 2, made the other one. Eventually, that's how the score finished. I think it's how it's finished. They came back to the dressing room and Francis Lee, the great old Manchester City and England player, went up to Malcolm Allison and said, Mal, do us a favour. Don't ever take George out on the piss again the night before our game.
Jeff, I've got to say, it's great to get you on Full Court Football 24. I really appreciate it, and I know how busy you are, so, mate, I always like spending a bit of time with you, and it's good to have a chat this time on the camera rather than just face-to-face.
It's a pleasure, James, and I encourage everybody to keep up to speed with this man.
Jeff Powell, thank you very much for your time. I look forward to catching you up again real soon, sir. Thank you.
Pleasure.